How did you brush your teeth?
What kind of food did you have to eat at the camps?
Did you ever think of running away before you got sent to the camps?
So these are my treasures that I want to show you. I asked the teachers to have the students send me something afterwards, a reflection or what they've learned from my speaking in the school. So that's how all of this comes about. And I've done it since 1987, so it's many years of talks to many students. So this young girl has been going through a very hard time. And she explains, my grandpa, who was really close and loved me very dearly, passed away over Christmas break. He had a stroke, and it was really hard for me because I didn't get to see him before he was too far gone. Since then, I've had a tough time battling with depression, and things were looking down. But you helped me a lot by telling your story, and since then, everything's gotten a bit better. It was really an inspiration to me to know that someone my age went through something so terrible and came out a stronger person who can have a great impact. It makes me feel like I can get through this too. Well, I think it's the students that keep me going. So I came to America and lived first with cousins, but there was one thing they told me the night I arrived in their apartment in New York City. They said, well, now you're here and you have to start a new life and you have to forget. You have to forget the past and don't ever talk about it. I think it's natural to think of yourself as a victim, having gone through all that you were victimized by this regime. And if you think of yourself as a victim, powerless position to be in, because if you are a victim, then that means that other people did things to you and you can't change it, and you carry that for the rest of your life, and the world owes you things. Turning it around to being a survivor is a much more powerful way of thinking about yourself. At a certain point, I felt I had to make a decision whether I wanted to see myself as a victim or see myself as a survivor. For me, I really wanted to encompass the joys of life. There's so much joy to be found. Like Anna Frank, I was born in Germany, emigrated with my family to the Netherlands in the 1930s, then suffered the German occupation and struggled for day-to-day survival. Anna and I were roughly the same age, lived in the same neighborhood in Amsterdam, and had mutual friends. While her family went into hiding, mine did not. But ultimately, we ended up in the same concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen, however, with different fates. My father was John Hasenberg. I had a very close, affectionate relationship with him. I adored him. And he was very warm and loving and playful. And he was always there for me. And for the first 6 years of my life, I had a very happy, carefree childhood. In 1933, Hitler came into power, and gradually conditions became increasingly horrible. Jews were kicked out of their homes. They lost their businesses. The synagogues were destroyed. My father, of course, lost his job, and my parents began to think about emigrating. And my father left to go to Holland to find work. Now, Holland is a country adjoining to Germany. It wasn't very far, but it was free, and it remained neutral during World War I, so we thought we would be safe. So I was 6 years old when we left for Holland. We came to Amsterdam. We lived in an apartment much more modestly than we had before. And there were 2 years in which life in Holland was very pleasant. After 2 years, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. And then the persecution of the Jews escalated. And exactly what we were trying to escape from followed us to our new country. My father met a friend on the street one day in Amsterdam who had just received Ecuadorian passports from a man in Sweden, and gave my father the name and address of this man and said, write to him, send the passport pictures of everyone in your family. You don't have to say very much, he'll know. And so my father did that immediately. Hitler's persecution continued. Jewish kids were expelled from the public schools, and we had to go to Jewish schools. That became a very sad experience because over time, fewer and fewer children still came to class because they were deported. Eventually, it became our turn. And then they go from house to house and from door to door and to find the Jews. And if you were Jewish, then they would give you 10 minutes to pack your belongings, and then you had to leave. And we were marched to a big square, and we were loaded on trucks and taken to a railroad station. And at the railroad station, there was this enormous cattle car, and we were all loaded into the cars. 60, 70 or more people into a car without water, without toilets. We were in this cattle car for about 8 hours on this very hot day to be taken to a camp, a German concentration camp in the Netherlands called Westerbork. After several months in Westerbork, the passports arrived. And I always call this the first miracle because we didn't get any mail forwarded from our home in Amsterdam to Westerbork. And once the passports had arrived, we were no longer at risk for being deported to Auschwitz. My family was very lucky. During the 8 months, we received word that we were going to be transported to another camp, a camp in Germany, which is supposed to be a privileged camp because we were going to be exchanged at some point for German citizens in America. This was connected to a policy of the Germans, Austausch, which means exchange, where the Germans were trying to get German citizens, civilians who were in Allied countries, back to Germany to help them win the war. So we traveled from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen. The minute we arrived there, we knew this was not a better camp.
Were there any punishments at the camp?
What were the beds like that you slept in? What was the consequences of a Jew being caught hiding?
Did you see Anne Frank when you were at Bergen-Belsen?
Actually, I did, yes, under very drastic circumstances. Anna was in the adjoining camp, which we were separated by barbed wire, and we weren't supposed to go even near the barbed wire. But at night, when the guards and the guideposts couldn't see much, she went to the fence and saw Anna, and she was very thin and pale, and she only had a blanket around her. She didn't have any clothes, so when Hanneli asked, what can we do for you? She said, well, if you could give me some clothes. And then Hanneli came back to the barrack. We were in the same barrack, Hanneli and I, and we collected clothes from various people. And the next night, we were supposed to meet her at the same place, same time, and threw over a bundle of clothes to Anna, but she no longer had her eyeglasses, and she didn't see it, and some other woman came by and picked up the bundle and ran off with it. You have to imagine an atmosphere where most people are out for themselves. And it's hard. You know, maybe even your former friends or neighbors or people you went to school with, kids you went to school with, everyone is out for themselves because it's a matter of survival. I really wanted to live. I really wanted to survive, so every night I went to bed, I hoped and prayed that I would wake up the next morning. The hardest part was learning to cope with death, because every day, towards the end of my stay in the concentration camp, every day you would wake up in the morning and you would look around and people had died during the night. And at a certain point, after we had been there almost 1 year, there was an announcement that the people who have these passports have to report to a doctor to be examined, and then there will be an exchange transport, and those people will leave the camp. The doctor, he looked at my father and he said, "Are you John Hausenberg?" He said, "Yes." And he looked at me and he checked off my mother's name, and then he said, "Well, your children have already been here, so get ready, because tomorrow you're going on the train and you're going to be exchanged." And this time it was a Red Cross train. It wasn't a cattle cart train, so that was a sign of encouragement. But then the second night on the train, that was the most tragic moment of my life. My father died. It was a big shock. His body was taken off the train at a town where the train stopped and wrapped up in his winter coat and put on a bench on the train station. My mother and my brother and I, we had no choice but to continue the journey. And that was really a terrible shock for all of us. We were so close to freedom, and yet he could not make it. So we continued the journey, and about 4 days later, we arrived in Switzerland, and my mother and brother were taken off the train and hospitalized immediately because they were very sick. And then the Swiss people did not allow me to stay in Switzerland. They did what the Nazis had never done. The Nazis had never split up my family. I was 14 years old. We were shipped on a little Italian freighter to a displaced persons camp in North Africa, in Algiers, where we stayed until the war ended a few months later. There were all kinds of lists of survivors, people who had survived from the concentration camps, and so luckily we had relatives in the United States, and they filed papers for us, affidavits, so that eventually we could come to America. I think I spent 2 years in high school and graduated, and then I was lucky. I got a scholarship to go to college for 4 years. I went to Queens College, which is a city college in New York City, and then went on to graduate school to study economics.
We were both graduate students at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. That was in 1956 or 57. And I was invited by a classmate of mine to go to a Hanukkah party that Irene and her roommate were holding. The latkes started coming out of the kitchen, and they were delicious, so I decided to explore and find out who was making these latkes, and then I discovered Irene. I think she was the first person I ever met who had been a victim of the Holocaust in such a direct way.
I don't think the two words go together. My mother and victim don't go together. There was nothing about her that, other than strength and positive thinking and determination, overcoming obstacles. That was pretty much all I saw. I just saw her as someone who is an example of how one can come out of terrible circumstances and turn it into a strength.
I met Irene when I started graduate school in public health, And I was sort of wowed by her. I didn't really know anything about her history or her personal life, but in terms of all that she had accomplished, she was my mentor in doing my thesis for underserved women in Detroit.
I dabbled a little bit with Siddha Yoga. I don't know whether any of you know what that is, but there's a guru, a woman, known as Guru Mai. I wonder if I really know anybody who is not a real guru, who is not deified, who is a normal person like all of us, and who lives a life of service, lives a life of kindness, lives a life of selflessness, and that person is Irene.
I wanted to ask you, over the years, after you've lived through that experience, how have you ever come to forgive the people that have done those things?
It took me a long time. I forgive now. I don't forgive neo-Nazis who continue to do those things, you know.
Yeah.
But I think one reason for forgiveness is if you don't, then you keep all this hatred inside you, and that's really self-destructive. You know, the Dalai Lama says he forgives the Chinese who are, you know, occupying Tibet. He says because they're doing it because they've suffered, they're in pain, and that's why they do these things. And so you have to understand people.
According to the Buddha's teachings, everybody has Buddha nature, or basic goodness. And my mom has always been in touch with this sense of basic goodness, which goes beyond bias. It goes beyond picking and choosing about who's better and who's worthwhile. It's a role model. It's wonderful to see that. I think we need people in our lives to exhibit those qualities. To have it as a person in your life is different.
What I became involved with in the 80s was the Wallenberg Project. I jumped on that as an opportunity to pay a debt, to justify my survival.
This has been a long, patient piece of work that Irene has committed herself to. And she, more than anybody, has been the person who has made this successful and possible.
It was a major effort. Well, it takes a lot of contacting people and going to visit them and pleading with them about how important this is. First of all the paperwork was done by me and a helpful secretary out of my office. So we were a grassroots group.
Irene has always been an advocate for how Wallenberg's life and Wallenberg's example can be seen as a template, as a model for all kinds of other people in all sorts of different walks of life, to standing up for those who are oppressed, for those who are voiceless, for organizing those people who are voiceless so they can gain their voices and advocate for themselves. Just like Wallenberg, one person can make a difference. The decision was made to create an annual lecture.
We thought of a chair until we found out that when a person is appointed to occupy a chair, you cannot tell them what to teach. They don't have to talk about human rights or about Wallenberg or about oppression or anything like that. So that was a drawback, you know. Then how would we honor Raoul Wallenberg? You know, if there was a Wallenberg chair, but it didn't have any strings attached to it.
It is a source of deep gratification to honor our 5th Wallenberg medalist, Mie Pries, who sheltered Anne Frank and her extended family in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. I am extremely pleased that she was able to make the long journey to be with us today, and her presence has a special personal meaning for me.
So I felt a great affinity to her, maybe to her more than any of the other Wallenberg speakers, and there really was you know, a closeness that was unusual for just a short encounter.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Please, do not look up to me. It does embarrass me very much. Kindly consider yourself to be my equal in providing support to all who live in fear and pain. People often ask why I found the courage to help the Franks. Yes, it certainly requires some courage, some discipline, and also some sacrifice to do your human duty. But that is true for so many things in life.
I just did my human duty. I love that phrase. I'm not a hero. I'm just an ordinary person. I just did my human duty. I had no choice. And she made that choice, and she never really accepted credit of any kind for what she had done. And I think that's true of a lot of the Wallenberg medalists.
I want to welcome everyone here today for this extraordinary occasion of the visit of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is the spiritual and secular leader of the people of Tibet. Having personally experienced foreign occupation and persecution during the Holocaust, I feel a special appreciation for those who have dedicated their lives to end suffering in the world.
It was persistence. We did not go away. And, you know, and Andy and I were Holocaust survivors, and we used that. Pamela went to Israel to find her Jewish identity. Mostly because of her parents. You know, I take responsibility. She hadn't really found it. So she went to Israel to find her Jewish identity and married a Palestinian.
I was shocked by this at the beginning because they're two different cultures, two different religions. You can't just stamp out religious or cultural differences.
This is a group that I co-founded in Ann Arbor. It's 6 Arab and 6 Jewish women who have been together for 9 years. We meet every other week in our homes and try to learn from each other. Well, I can all attribute it to Pamela. She introduced me to another people, another culture. And she lived in a country where every day she lives that conflict. So I became very interested in the Arab-Jewish conflict. And, I met some other people here in Ann Arbor who had children over there. For one, we made a very conscious decision that we were not going to talk about the conflict until we knew each other and had built trust and safety. So we spent more than 1 year, I think, just listening to each other's narratives. And before we really started talking about controversial issues. And it's been a really wonderful learning experience, growing, enriching. And now we're 8.5 years old. I can't imagine Zaytuna not being part of my life anymore.
The topics we talk about have to do with the occupation, have to do with events, what happens from week to week, what has just happened before we meet, incursions in Gaza, houses demolished.
I didn't read it carefully. Maybe he said a couple because I thought
he said, could you, and a
thank you.
Oh, happy birthday.
We can put it back on the tray.
For the chosen.
What appealed to me, what I thought was so beautiful, was that these children were raised in both cultures. Amelie and Shireen, and they are now 22 and 19 years old. And, they haven't figured it out yet. They struggle with the double identity.
Today, the Genesis Board is proud to present the Genesis Humanitarian Award to someone who has worked for years to bridge differences and foster understanding and friendship between those who otherwise might view each other with distrust and hostility, who has worked year after year to oppose war, who chose never to be a bystander when faced with injustice and wrong, who lived through the Holocaust, faced the darkness of its unimaginable horror.
Well, this is a time of Thanksgiving, and I have a lot to be thankful for. This is far more than I deserve, because all the activities that have been mentioned have their own reward. They have enriched my life, they have inspired me, they have led to new friends. So I feel completely rewarded by everything I've done and all the members of this community that have worked with me and all others as well. So thank you so much.
Do you still fear that something like that could happen again?
Yes, I think it could happen again. That's why it's so important never to be a bystander, because, you know, there was Hitler, and there were the Nazis, and they were the perpetrators, and then there were all the people who were the victims. But what about all the others? What if they had done something? Students who say, I never even thought about the idea of a bystander. I'm not very outspoken, and it's hard for me to do something when I see that things are going on that I don't agree with or that don't conform to my values. But then she might say, but from now on, I don't want to be that way. You know, I want to be more proactive.
What can we do not to be bystanders?
Very important question. Well, first of all, I think we all have, each and every one of us has the responsibility to stand up against evil, against bullying, against theft, against any kind of immoral behavior. Practicing not being a bystander is not simple. Sometimes it's scary, but still, if you believe strongly that certain things are wrong and they shouldn't happen, then you can interrupt, you can stop the behavior, you can look for help, and sometimes if you're the first one to object, you may have a following, because other people may feel the same way, but there has to be the first person who can make the difference. If you think of yourself as a victim, it's a powerless position to be in, because if you are a victim, then that means that other people did things to you and you can't change it, and you carry that for the rest of your life, and the world owes you things. The turning it around to being a survivor is a much more powerful way of thinking about yourself. To think of yourself as a survivor is a process of empowerment. It gives you the ability to make things happen, or at least to try to make things happen and not just cave in to the negativity that might be around you. Dear Dr. Butter, I really appreciate your taking time to come and visit our school. It must take a lot of courage to retell that story year after year. I don't have a story to tell that relates to yours, but you have inspired me to make my life a story worth telling. I want to make this world a better place for everyone, and hearing you speak has been a wake-up call. Every day, people go through things similar to what you did. Luckily, there are people like you who are trying to change that. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to take nothing for granted. So, once again, I thank you for everything.
gambled, but only on things that count. We wouldn't trade a moment with you for no matter what the amount. Irene, you're 80 now. Irene, it's true. We wish you love, we wish you joy, and we sing happy birthday to you. You've shared yourself with family and with folks the whole world wide, and the world is such a better place 'cause you are by our side. Irene, you're 80 now. Irene, it's true. We wish you love, we wish you joy, and we sing happy